In the Harlem Renaissance Part 2, we're going to look at the people who created the art of the Harlem Renaissance. And you should think of artists such as Jacob Lawrence, authors such as Langston Hughes, and musicians such as Duke Ellington, which you heard about in the previous part about the Harlem Renaissance, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith. The first person I'm going to discuss is Jacob Lawrence, who grew up in a settlement house in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. His parents were among those who migrated between 1916 and 1919, so they were considered to be part of the first wave of the migration. His own life in Harlem and the struggle of other Black Americans inspired his early work. So he was a painter who painted scenes of his own background in Harlem, but also of the hard life of Black Americans in the 1920s, and the Great Migration series is his most recognized work. Then we move on to Langston Hughes, the author. Hughes is known for his insightful, colorful, realistic portrayals of Black life in America. He wrote poetry, short stories, novels and plays, and he is known for his involvement with the world of jazz and the influence it had on his writing. His life and work were enormously important in shaping the artistic contributions of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. He wanted to tell the stories of his people in ways that reflected their actual culture, including both their suffering and their love of music, laughter, and language itself. Okay, now we're going to focus on two poems by Langston Hughes. The first is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and the second poem we're going to look at is I Too Sing America. Let's first talk a little bit about Hughes' contributions to the Harlem Renaissance. One of Hughes' poetic innovations was to draw on the rhythms of Black musical traditions such as jazz and blues, but in The Negro Speaks of Rivers, it's the heritage of Negro spirituals which is recalled by the poem's majestic imagery and sonorous repetitions. Written when Hughes was only 17 as he traveled by train across the Mississippi, The Negro Speaks of Rivers is a beautiful statement of strength in the history of Black people, which Hughes imagines stretching as far back as ancient Egypt and further into Africa and the cradle of civilization. The poem returns at the end to America in a moment of optimistic alchemy when he sees the muddy bosom of the Mississippi turn all golden in the sunset. As you listen to the poem, I'd like you to take notes and answer the following questions. The first one is, what is the tone or mood of this poem? 2. Why do you think the poem was written and for what audience? And 3. List 2 things in this poem that tell you about life in the United States at the time.
I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
The second poem by Langston Hughes that we're going to listen to is called I Too Sing America. I Too, written just before Hughes' return to the States from Europe and after he'd been denied passage on a ship because of his color, has a contemporary feel in contrast to the mythical dimension of The Negro Speaks of Rivers. It is no less powerful, however, in its expression of social injustice. The calm, clear statements of the I have an unstoppable force like the progress the poem envisages. Hughes' dignified introductions to these poems and his beautiful speaking voice render them all the more moving. Before we're going to listen, however, I'd like you to once again think about the following questions. What is the tone or mood of this poem? Why do you think the poem was written and for what audience? List 2 things in this poem that tell you about life in the United States.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well. and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I, too, am America.
To sum up, Langston Hughes was a poet and author who wrote poetry, short stories, novels and plays. He is known for his colorful, realistic portrayals of black life in America. Duke Ellington was a jazz composer, conductor and performer during the Harlem Renaissance. You will remember him from the first part of the Harlem Renaissance videos. During the formative Cotton Club years, he experimented with and developed a style that would quickly bring him worldwide success. He would be among the first to focus on musical form and composition in jazz. Ellington wrote over 2,000 pieces in his lifetime. The Duke Ellington Orchestra was the house orchestra for a number of years at the Cotton Club. The revues featured glamorous dancing girls, acclaimed tap dancers, vaudeville performers and comics. All the white world came to Harlem to see the show. The first Cotton Club revue was in 1923. There were 2 new fast-paced revues produced a year for at least 16 years. Louis Satchmo Armstrong was a jazz composer and trumpet player during the Harlem Renaissance. He is widely recognized as a founding father of jazz. He appeared in 30 films and averaged 300 concerts per year, performing for both kids on the street and heads of state. Bessie Smith was a famous jazz and blues singer during the Harlem Renaissance. She recorded with many of the great jazz musicians of the 1920s, including Louis Armstrong. Smith was popular with both blacks and whites. To conclude this part of the Harlem Renaissance Part 2, I'd like you to study a painting by Lois Mailou Jones called Ascent from Ethiopia, 1932. Study the picture for 2 minutes. Form an overall impression of the painting and then start to focus on individual details. There are a number of questions to think about. 1. Quite simply, what do you see? 2. What people do you see? 3. What objects do you see? 4. What colors do you see? 5. What actions, activities do you see? 6. What questions does this painting raise in your mind? 7. How does this painting relate to the Harlem Renaissance? And 8. Based on what you have observed, list what you may infer from this painting. Please take notes in your notebooks and come to class prepared.